This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Let's start with a few notes about the podcast. Summer is here, and I'm finding it harder and harder to get a weekly podcast out the door at the same level of quality. Early on, I started editing the podcast to get rid of the false starts, the ahs, the ums, the maniacal laughter, and this adds a bit of quality to the experience of listening to the podcast. I'm finding that now that summer is here, that I'm struggling to get the interviews done, the editing done, and the marketing done. And rather than skimp on the quality, I have to give myself permission to relax on the release schedule. So, all of this to say, I'm going to keep doing interviews, I'm going to keep doing podcasts. I just am not going to guarantee that every episode will be out on a weekly basis. This way, the podcast continues, it continues at the same level of quality, and I don't beat myself up in guilt if I miss a week or two. For example, I know the week of the 4th of July coming up, I'm very likely to miss that week's episode. I guess I'm asking for you to stick with me. If you find the podcast useful or helpful, hopefully you'll be able to handle a slightly more erratic schedule for a time. Speaking of supporting the podcast, if you can rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, that makes the podcast much more visible for potential new listeners. A quick note about the last few episodes, including today's episode. I have consciously not delved into the topic of apologetics and counter-apologetics very much. I've really tried to focus on the human stories of deconversion and the work that people are doing around that space. But the last couple of episodes, we've touched on young earth creationism and to some degree or another apologetics. And today's episode with Andrew Knight, apologetics or counter-apologetics are kind of front and center. I also have lined up John Lapilato, the counter-apologist, for an interview the night before this releases. All of this to say, if counter-apologetics is not your thing, please hang with me. I'm aware that this is slightly different in format, and I promise that I'm trying to get to the human stories of the counter-apologists and what their deconversion stories mean to them. Deconversion, secular grace, humanism, and honesty contests will continue to be the foundation of the podcast. On to today's episode. My guest today is Andrew Knight. Andrew swaps co-hosting and hosting roles with last week's guest, Matthew Taylor. Andrew is the host of the Still Unbelievable podcast and the co-host of the Ask an Atheist Anything podcast. He's a contributing author to the book Still Unbelievable. Andrew has also been a recovering from religion peer support agent, helping others through their questioning. And he promotes the message, talking about human problems from a human perspective, and that human problems have human solutions. Andrew states flatly that the faith tradition he was raised in, the Church of Christ, is a cult. And after attending Bible college and working for an apologetics publishing company, he began to be disillusioned with apologetics. He came to recognize that the foundational claims of Christianity were not true. The conversation with Andrew is wide-ranging. We cover his deconversion story, his college experience, his work with reasonpress.net, and how deconverts are the most dangerous form of counter-apologetics. What may become obvious within the conversation is that Andrew and I have a lot in common. We're both technical and geeks, and we geek out quite a bit. We spent about 30 minutes before the conversation and about an hour after the conversation that's recorded, just chatting with each other and comparing notes. So I hope that comes through. I hope that Andrew becomes a good friend. And with that, I give you Andrew Knight. Andrew Knight, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be with you.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, I understand that you are the host of the Still Unbelievable podcast. You're the co-host of the Ask an Atheist Anything podcast, and you're a contributing author to the book Still Unbelievable.
That's right. I think maybe you had Matthew Taylor on maybe last week or in the last few days.
That's correct. Yes.
And we sort of swapped spots. So he's the co-host on Still Unbelievable, and he's the host of Ask an Atheist Anything. And I feel honored to be able to follow Matthew in conversation with you.
Yeah, this has been great. As I mentioned in the previous episode, it was Tom from Hiding in Plain Sight that got us all together.
Yeah, Tom's a great guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Loved having him on my podcast, and I heard his episode on Still Unbelievable, and that was great as well.
He's quite a penetrating thinker, Tom.
Definitely, yeah. We exchanged emails together and kind of hit it off. And anyway, I'm very glad to have you on the podcast. We spent about 10 minutes in the pre-podcast geeking out about our tech background, which we'll have to do more of some other time.
Definitely. We're looking forward to having you on Ask an Atheist Anything, just so that we can continue to explain to the world that Unix is the operating system to use.
That is right. I am +1 on that. Absolutely. You've shared a little bit with me, but I want to do so on the podcast here, a little bit about your background. And you were just telling me about your college experience. Maybe let's begin there. What was your faith tradition background like? And let's start with your story from that point.
Okay, sure. So I went to college. I think first year was 1988, if I remember correctly. And I went to a small private Christian college. I'll tell you that my faith tradition is Church of Christ.
Okay.
And so for your listeners that aren't familiar with the Church of Christ is the 12th largest Christian denomination in the United States, based on the most recent numbers that I can find. And we're a cult. Church of Christ is a cult. So
okay.
I don't know how many listeners, how many guests you've had that have been members of cult denominations. So,
right. I know there's been a lot of discussion online lately of just the, former evangelicals talking about the elements of evangelicalism in general that are cultish. No, I have not yet had someone who's identified as having been a part of a cult yet. So this is interesting.
Well, so I actually took a class in university about cults. It was called, I think it was Denominational Doctrines 2. So it's the second section of that particular course. And we talked about pillars of cults, right? What are the traits that separate a denomination from a cult that is a denomination, right?
Right.
And there's some interesting markers there. So taking peripheral beliefs and transitioning them to central importance.
Okay.
Secret writings or secret interpretation, the belief that your group is the only one going to heaven, right?
Yeah.
The typical isolation techniques, all of those kinds of things are earmarks of a cult.
Right.
And we had every one of them in spades. And the professor that taught this class, I'll tell you that, so, a bunch of Bible students in this class, right? There's about like there was going to be a whole lot of interest in denominational doctrines outside of those of us who were interested in theology. And what was interesting about discussing these pillars of cultism in this class was this professor said at each point where we were identifying a trait of a cult, right? Like taking peripheral doctrines and promoting them to themes of central importance, right?
Yeah.
At every turn, he'd have to say, okay, now this is an identifying characteristic of a cult, but the Church of Christ isn't a cult.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And a true story.
Wow.
Right. And I'll just tell you that a lot of us walked away. And I don't know that this was the first day of my finding the exit, but it was an important day.
Okay.
In the sense that we had to start asking some pretty penetrating questions about our own commitments, right? At every turn when someone says, we look like a cult, but we're not because.
Right.
If that doesn't cause moments of reflection, you're not thinking hard enough. And it took me, another 15 years or something like that to leave Christianity.
Right.
But I eventually realized you can paint it however you would like. But if every time you find some aspect of cultism and you say, yeah, we do that, but we're not a cult because, that's just indoctrination.
Absolutely. And I think you've touched on something also that's important, is that, it may not be all of a sudden that the deconversion process is over all in an instant. It's that these little touch points where you reflect back and say, with hindsight, you can see that was a point at which, one of the foundational blocks was removed and the Jenga tower eventually becomes unstable.
That's right. And paired with this, right after college, I was in my first job managing some computer information systems at a high school, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, but this was an academic magnet school, and so there were no instructors on staff that had less than a master's degree.
Okay.
In their discipline, and I don't know, something like 60% of the staff were PhDs. But a fellow named Sean had a master's degree in physics, and he was a nice guy, and he was willing to tolerate a member of a cult in conversation. That member being me, right?
Okay.
And so we were in the hall talking one day, and Sean said to me, in talking about truth, right? Because cults are always about this notion of truth, right? We have this revealed truth, and we sort of use the word truth in a disingenuous way, right? As if we have a truth that is somehow special to us, and truth should never be that thing, right?
Right.
So Sean said that for him, truth was a process of successive approximation.
Yeah.
And that was along with this idea that I was actually a member of a cult, there was a really important counter idea to my notion of truth, right? That God has specially visited me with this idea of truth, right? That I have some sort of penetrating intellect or special access to truth that all the other poor sods out there. Thank you, Matthew, for British phrasing.
Yes.
That I have some special access to this notion of truth that other humans don't have, and so it was revolutionary to me. It's a guy from Central Alabama, right? That truth was something that we could approach in an iterative way,
right,
and actually get better at truth,
right.
And that was an important deconstruction moment for me. In fact, it may be that one phrase stands as the largest pivot point in my deconversion story. Changing the notion of truth to something that could be investigated and we could get better at.
Interesting. I've got somewhat similar, not quite exactly the same, but I was reading some fantasy novel I don't remember the name of. Actually, I do remember the name of it. It was called Wizard's First Rule.
Oh, Terry Goodkind.
Yes, there you go. Yeah.
It's an awesome book.
Yeah, and in it, the character, and I'm going to murder the quote here, but the character basically leverages the fact that he learns that people will believe anything that they want to believe, or they will believe anything they're afraid is true. And he then goes on to manipulate everyone around him based on those two ideas. And that was very early on in kind of the middle of my Christianity. And that always haunted me. I could never let that go. I could never work my way around that argument that I wanted this thing to be true so badly. There was some part of me that knew that there was no objective underpinning to what I believed. And that was ultimately the end of my deconversion as well.
Right. Let's see. If I'm not mistaken, I think that the character was Zedekias Zool Zorander.
Oh, see, you're too good. Okay.
I think that was the character. And I didn't encounter that quote until sort of after I was already out. I was still going to church,
Mm-hmm.
but it was important to me that, we are afraid of those things that we think might be true,
Mm-hmm.
or things that we're afraid are true, or things that we think might be true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Christianity plays heavily on both sides of that quote, right? So there are things that
Absolutely.
we want to be true, like the idea of heaven, right?
Right.
And there are things that we're afraid are true, like the idea of hell.
Mm-hmm.
And Christianity plays very heavily on both sides of those things. But in that way, it seems to me that Christianity fails to meet the burden of its obligation. This was a big deal for me in deconversion. When I say, did somebody turn water into wine in the New Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or did someone call fire down from the heavens to consume the prophets of Baal in
Right.
the Old Testament? Or did the angel of death actually avoid killing the firstborn of all of the children of Israel who happened to have lamb's blood on the lintels of their doors, right?
Right.
Well, those are all interesting claims. But here's something that Christianity didn't get to for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually the central themes of the obligations of Christianity that it should prove. Because maybe a God can consume the prophets of Baal. Let's just pretend for a moment that that's possible. I think we're stepping back into Wizard's first rule to
Yes.
propose that it's true. But let's pretend that it is.
And I agree with you. I do this quite often, like grant for the sake of argument
Right.
that this thing is true, and then find out what the implications are. So that's what you're doing. Sorry, I
Right.
interrupted you. So go ahead.
No, that's okay. So granting that something like that is possible, here's what it doesn't get you. It doesn't get you a God that can live forever.
Right.
So let's say then maybe there's a God that can turn water to wine. Just the incarnated Jesus, right? But
Yeah.
we're still talking about the aspect of Jesus as God rather than as human, right? It's changed this wedding water into wine. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so let's say that that's somehow possible. It doesn't demonstrate in any way that there's a God who knows everything, or
Right.
a God that has a right to judge, or a God that can even explain his notions of knowing the future, or any actual central claim of Christianity that is to me the important reason to believe.
Right. No, I see exactly what you're saying, that the miracles of the New Testament or the Old Testament even really don't prove the character of God or the central claims of Christianity.
Well, that's right. And so it works a little like this for listeners who may still be wondering, are we on an important pivot point? Here's why this is important. We see it in our own reasoning. People will say from time to time something like, we can put a man on the moon, but why can't we cure cancer?
Mm-hmm.
As if they're necessary equivalents, right?
Right.
And so there is a mental mistake here. When we say maybe there's some supernatural person that can change water to wine or cast fire down from the heavens, the ability to do those things, if indeed something like that were possible, and again, I think we're just back into sort of truth territory.
Right.
The ability to do any of those things doesn't demonstrate the claim that some being can know everything, or have the right to judge, or have the capacity to form the fundamental laws from the universe out of the ability to speak them into existence, or the ability to rightly divide all of the good people and all of the evil people perfectly. We don't get to any of those things through the story of the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
And that is why this idea of the things that we think are true or afraid, the things we want to be true, or the things that we're afraid might be true, those are not addressed
Right.
in the pages of the Bible, to bring this full circle.
Right. No, I agree. That's an interesting insight that I had not considered.
Well, we'll have to leave it for your listeners to see how important they think the insight is, right? But there it is,
Yeah.
and that is another one of the reasons that I found my way to the door in my exploration of Christian apologetics.
And that's a good segue. I understand that apologetics was a major part of your story. And so tell us about when you started to explore apologetics for its stated goals and then how that affected what you thought about it.
So when I was in college, I worked for what was at the time, I think, the second largest Christian apologetics publishing company in the United States. And they're now largely defunct. And if it's okay, I'd rather not even give their name because I don't want to promote them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I worked for this company. And to be fair, we had good staff members, David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had staff members. One had a PhD in microbiology. We had someone with a PhD in something like geochemistry, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were scientists, in a professional sense, right? They had all of the credentials that would make us say these people are qualified scientists.
Mm-hmm.
But we were young Earth creationists. So we believed in a literal 6,000 years of creation. We believed in the global, universal, worldwide flood of Noah. We thought that men and dinosaurs walked the earth at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, all of the kinds of, forgive me, listeners, all the kinds of quackery that go along with a 6,000-year-old universe, including creating light between the stars, and the universe just has this sort of appearance of age, right?
Interesting. Okay.
Right. But here's what we didn't have. In this building where we wrote about science, in this building where we are supposedly tying Jehovah God
mm-hmm.
to the human endeavor of science, in this building where we take the important scientific discoveries of the time, deconstruct them to attach them to this 6,000 years of creation,
mm-hmm.
we didn't have a single scale. We didn't have a single test tube.
Right.
We didn't have a single telescope. We had absolutely no tools of science. But what we did have is our standing commitment to the idea that something like the genealogies in the Old Testament and the New Testament leave no room for the universe to be anything other than 6,000 years old.
Right.
And you can't do anything with that at some point.
Yeah.
If you find you can't hang your hat on that, and eventually I couldn't, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't because it seems dishonest for a God to create a universe where it has this appearance of age in every way that we can explore, right? Fossil light that travels billions of years to get to our remnants. Carbon dating. And I know there's controversy around carbon dating. We can talk about that if you want, but the controversy is trumped up by young Earth creationists.
Right.
Everything that we can do science-wise indicates an Earth that's a little over 4 billion years old, a universe that's close to 14 billion years old, and a God that would give an appearance of age at billions of years.
Yes.
And then claim only 6,000 years just seemed to be more dishonest than a God that I could say was good and worth worshiping.
Good point. I'm struck by a couple of things. I had a guest on a few episodes back named Eric Carlson, who was also a scientist, also a young Earth creationist when he was Christian, and he talked about the implications of being a young Earth creationist. That then, the current implications in that you don't care about things like climate change. You don't care about.
It's absolutely true.
That these ideas, these beliefs, actually have effects in the real world today. Do you find that to be true?
Oh, I absolutely do. I have listened to a couple of you. We only got together last week, right? And so I hate to admit that I haven't gotten through your whole back catalog, but it's not because.
Try not to hold it against you.
Please don't, because I will get through them all.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to Eric's episode yet, but I'll say that he's right on the money, because here's what you can do with young Earth creationism. You can deny climate warming.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely true, but it reaches, well, I'm sure Eric knows this, it reaches deeply into our concepts of medicine. It reaches deeply into our ideas around family, the evolution of human beings, our adaptability to the environment. Why is that important? Because if there is no adaptation, right, to our environment, we can in some sense be quite cavalier about our being God's crowning creation, right?
Yes.
And we don't have to pay attention very much to the rights of animals. And I'm not about I don't want to have a conversation about animal testing or something like that.
Right. But it has implications.
It does have implications, and a lot of these are tied. So it's not specifically tied to young Earth creationism, but the way young Earth creationists do science reaches into almost every aspect of our lives in some way.
Right.
And it's nasty business. And in fact, the way we did this thing was not to care overly much about the latest great discovery.
Mm-hmm.
We only cared about the latest great discovery that all the Pew Packers cared about. And so we would sit around on Sunday mornings and listen to what people were talking about in the pews.
Right.
What science are our members talking?
Mm-hmm.
And we'd read the headlines, and we would pull out those aspects of science that were worth attacking from a young Earth creationist standpoint. So what I'm saying is we had no consistent science.
Right.
We were just attacking whatever people thought were interesting discoveries of the day in order to continue promoting young Earth creationism. And if there's a young Earth creationist, by the way, listening, I would love to have you talk with them about what consistent young Earth creation science is.
Mm-hmm.
And or they're welcome to reach out to me. We can do it in writing. We can with you included, because this is your show.
Well, no, we'll give you an opportunity at the end here to let people know how they can get in touch with you for sure. I recommend people get in touch with my guests directly, but.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. But I'm not trying to. I don't want to. All I'm saying is, this is a conversation worth having. What does consistent young Earth creationism look like?
Mm.
Because right now we don't know. It's
Right.
not like there's a young Earth creation model that is successful at predicting future outcomes, or at taking that model and looking into the past to see what the Earth might have been like prior to recorded history, right?
Right.
And so what else? We didn't do science. We did faith.
Right.
And used the words of science.
So many things I want to respond to that. One of which, you're saying, no actual tests, no test tubes, no telescopes.
None.
It wasn't until way after my deconversion that I had the words to describe this, and that is that arguments are not evidence.
That is absolutely right.
It seems to me that all of apologetics is about arguments without evidence. And then two, what is different about science, and this for me was a huge part of my deconversion, was recognizing the trustworthiness of the results of science. Science can disagree with itself. It can have all kinds of problems, but it's eventually consistent. It eventually gets to a point where there's a reasonable consensus, and the data is available, and the test frameworks are available for anyone who's interested. And that is that that science makes predictions, and you've nailed that as well, that science will make a model of the thing they're trying to describe, which will make predictions both in the future and the past that then you can test against. You can say, hey, this matches the model or it doesn't match the model. And then that gives it more or less integrity. And what I think is so fascinating about religion in general, apologetics specifically, is that they don't really make predictions. They're backfilling, they're back matching data, as it were.
Yep.
And then when they get challenged on it, rather than recognizing that, my model, my worldview doesn't quite fit the data, it's defensive, right? And it's no,
That's right.
the argument cannot be wrong. And so there's there's kind of an inherent dishonesty there that I find difficult to swallow.
So I do too. It's one of those things that you learn in, you go to iTunes U and you audit a logic course, any symbolic logic course. I don't know how many of them there are. I'm guessing that there's more than one. I took symbolic logic in college, and you don't get out of chapter 2 before. By the way, I'm being serious. That's Irving M. Copey. Is the author. It's Symbolic Logic, 5th edition, if anybody's wondering what textbook I'm talking about here. You don't get out of chapter 2 of that textbook before you encounter this idea. For an argument to be an argument worth considering, it has to have 2 things: truth and validity. My apologies to Professor Copey for not remembering whether truth is the one where you test it against the real world, or whether validity is the one you test against the real world. And then the other one is that the argument holds together, right? That its conclusion is required by the premises. So obviously we're talking about a deductive argument here, right? But in that way, I think apologetics fails to meet its burden. So when you approach some apologetics argument, I think you're right on to say, here's this argument, and the argument sounds good, right? And the conclusion, the therefore in the argument, seems to be required by however many preceding premises you have for the argument, right? And that can be quite lengthy, and it can be quite involved. But if you can't test it, for instance, there's a God that can live forever, or there's a God that does know everything, or there's a God that is all powerful, or there's a God that does have the ability to rightly divide the good people and the evil people.
Yeah.
If you can't test those things, then friends, I tell you now, walk away.
Right.
Because we know that this is how good argumentation is done. And it's not just in apologetics. This is not a rule of science. If you're a science denier, that's fine. I don't actually care in the sense that I'm talking about here. I mean, you shouldn't be.
Sure.
Because empiricism is by far the best tool that we've had for unscrewing the inscrutable. But this is not science in that sense. This is how we reason about whether we can believe our friend when they say, I've got a car that gets 750 miles to the gallon. Right? I mean, this is how we test any sort of argument when we're standing around the water cooler at work. We want to know that what the person says sounds reasonable and that it can be tested.
Yes.
And apologetics fails that burden, in my view.
I totally agree. I feel like we could definitely go on with.
We can beat this horse.
And it feels like that's more your podcast, so I'll be on your podcast. We'll talk about this some more. What I want to get to is, so your exposure to apologetics, your exposure to making the young Earth creationist arguments, and you're working for a company that sells these products. What I want to get to is the heart of your experience. How did that begin to? Did that create doubts? What part of your story, how does that play a part in your story?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that it was easy for me to continue in Christianity for another 10 or 15 years because, first of all, I had to believe that these people who were smarter than I was, and I have no problem acknowledging that the guys that I worked with were smarter than me. I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
And so I depended on the argument from authority to remain in Christianity. And Christianity works largely this way, right? The Apostle Paul said it, and I can't argue with it. Or there's a God that can look into my mind and read all my thoughts. And so I don't have any right to argue with God, right? And so no matter, I'm standing in the face of an almighty God, right? And no matter how wrong things seem to look to me, I can depend on the argument from authority to remain in Christianity. And that was really easy. And I remained in Christianity because, look, if you ever want a sense of community, if you ever want a sense of belonging, if you ever want to feel like you're doing righteous work and you're contributing to the world and that sort of thing, be a member of a cult.
Yeah.
Right. Now you can also be on the outs with the cult, like in 9 seconds. I might tell those stories in a few minutes. I'll tell you that no one in the Church of Christ talks to me now. None.
That's terrible.
I haven't talked to a member of the Church of Christ since 2009, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Yeah.
You really find out who your real friends are very, very quickly in this process.
Right. Now, maybe I should be fair, right? Because I actually agree with your approach here on this podcast, and that is to share the vulnerability, right? To be real. So let me do that and be honest that I also haven't been good at reaching out.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I should be honest about that, but I'll back my reticence by saying that in these days, in this decade right now, the Church of Christ practices disfellowship.
Yeah.
So if you have any listeners that don't know what that is, you get somebody who's maybe practicing something that feels a little bit like apostate belief of some kind, right? Maybe they support abortion, or maybe they drink on the weekends, or maybe they think evolution is true, or whatever. The Church of Christ will write you a letter and turn their back on you.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Now, I don't mean every Church of Christ. I mean your congregation may write you, and I actually worshipped in congregations that wrote letters of disfellowship. So I feel somewhat justified in hesitating to try to renew those contacts, right? But I haven't.
I think it's also a good point, though, and this may not be your case, but in general, the people listening, your safety is important and your mental well-being is important. And, it's not your obligation to reach back to people who have disfellowshipped you, right? They really, it's their obligation to reach out to you in actual human love.
Right. Well, and over the course of a life just spent doing whatever my life led me to, I now live 4 or 5 hours away from that part of the country. And so there may well be, I can't imagine who it would be, to be honest, thinking through the Rolodex of people that I knew there. I can't imagine one of them trying to reach out to say, hey, I know you're an atheist, but because the truth is that's just not the story. Yeah. Right. I mean, how often have you had a guest, and you may have had one, a guest that said, I turned up an atheist and my church friends still love me?
So I think that is a mixed bag. I don't want to be unfair to everyone. I can say that when I mentioned you find out who your real friends are, I'm kind of an introvert, so I tend to build few but strong relationships. So my close friends really rode this out with me. Now, they're not beating down the door to ask me what my best argument for the non-existence of God is. but they love me, and I love them, and there's mutual respect. And there is another layer of people who said they were friends who have totally ignored me, have not contacted me, that kind of thing. So I do think that you can experience both. You can have friends who are still strong believers who, in fact, that's kind of a theme of the podcast, is trying to keep the bridges built and not burning them on your way out for the people that are in your life that you really care about, right?
Right.
The flip side of that is if they're on the other end with blowing that bridge up, you're under no obligation to try to save it, right?
Sure.
My question to you is, just to turn it back to you, is, did you have any believers in your life that came to you and asked why?
A little.
Okay.
A little, but not in the Church of Christ.
Okay.
Not in the Church of Christ.
I've been shocked at how it really almost zero people have asked me why. I've told a couple people unsolicited, But I have friends from Bible college in particular who, we loved philosophy. We loved, 3-hour conversations about theology, and I thought for sure I'm going to have great conversations with these people. Not only have I not had conversations about why I left, I've had very little contact at all because I think I'm dangerous to them, right?
I think that is right. The problem with Bible college is, in order to prop up Christianity, at least in my experience, I don't know, we'll see if your experience was the same, right? But Bible college, part of its mission is to create true believers.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can lean heavily on verses about, casting your pearls before swine, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And about knowing when to shake the dust off of your feet, right? And leave a person behind. To create true believers, we leaned very heavily on those ideas.
Yeah.
And the Church of Christ still does. And not one member of the Church of Christ has ever asked me why I walked away, but I have gotten that question from my mother.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And she's dyed in the wool. She's a true believer.
Yeah.
And her love for her youngest son reached so deep that she actually decided to ask me why I became an atheist. And we were able to maintain a relationship after the answer.
That's fantastic. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, and we didn't have a great relationship growing up. They, broken. You remember the whole 80s story, rampant divorce, that sort of thing. I'm a product of that generation.
Yeah.
Not a sob story. I grew up fine. Just like a lot of kids that came out of the 80s, we're doing fine.
Yeah. We're surviving.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm just saying that we didn't have a great relationship because we didn't spend a lot of time together, right? But she was able, despite what she hears in her little Baptist church about atheists being socialists or atheists being communists or atheists being Democrats. I'm not, I swear to your listeners, I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
An atheist is a socialist, communist, Democrat.
Yeah.
Who probably also harbors, feelings of homosexuality or whatever. I mean, we are. Pew Research numbers show that atheists are the least trusted social class in the United States.
Yeah.
We are not even as trusted as former felons.
Yeah.
True numbers. But my mom actually was able to step outside of all of that and say, why don't you believe in God? And was able to hear the real reasons, some of them that we just talked about over the last 15 or 20 or 30 minutes, whatever it's been. And but my dad, who is a dyed in the wool Southern Baptist, he can't ask those questions. Right. In fact, I'll tell your listeners, I've got a baby on the way in the next week or so. Right?
Congratulations!
Thank you. We're very happy. But this baby, my girlfriend because she's not my wife, we're not married, right? And we're not married on purpose.
Scandalous, I say.
I know it's completely unbelievable, right? How could you not follow the convention of marriage? But my dad is so dyed in the wool Southern Baptist that until just a few months ago, now my girlfriend and I have been together for 5 or 6 years, right? And we would go home to my little part of central Alabama, right? And my dad would not let us stay in his house.
Wow.
Yeah, true story. Now, to be fair to my dad, because we should be fair to our parents, right? We should be fair to everybody, but try to be fair to your mom and dad.
Yeah.
So to be fair to him, he got over it. But it took 5 years, and it took this statement. I can only live my life to make one of us happy.
Mm.
And Allison makes me happy. And the idea that you can somehow share a room with your wife because you love her, but I can't share a room with my girlfriend, and I'm absolutely positive I feel the same way about her,
Mm-hmm.
comes from a place that I can't respect. And we had to have that conversation. So in other words, the subtext between me and my dad is, you can forget about forcing marriage on us.
Right.
So there's years of subtext there, right? And the subtext is, you've got to get married before you can stay. Well, no, I don't. And we
Yes.
and we don't, because we love our relationship the way it is.
Right.
Anyway, well, a little more personal history.
And you're both adults and you can make your own decisions. But
Well,
yes.
that's right. But this is all in some way about Christianity, right?
Right.
About a Christianity that I couldn't tolerate. Now, you may have Christian listeners who say, well, yeah, that's just proof that he loves his sin. Okay, fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that's where we are. But I also love the people around me.
Yes.
And my lack of belief in a God doesn't mean anything other than I have a lack of belief in a God.
Mm-hmm.
Atheists are no more likely to steal from you. Atheists are no more likely to harm children. Atheists are no more likely to slack off on their work responsibilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are as likely to be good people as Christians are. And it seems to me to be a wild fabrication to not address those real issues between Christians and atheists. Because if you ask the big questions, right? If you say to an atheist, would you harm me? The answer will be no.
Yeah.
If you ask an atheist, you know what, my lawnmower's broken, I need to mow my lawn. Yeah. If you call an atheist in the middle of the night because you've got a blown tire on the interstate, we're going to rally around and get you home. And so for the big issues in life, Christians and atheists see things very much the same way.
Very well said.
Yeah. Why should we? I'm not sure why God, this idea of a, this all-powerful, all-present, all-knowing being in the sky, I'm not sure why that separates us, David.
That is very, very insightful. I think one of the things we talk about a lot on the podcast here is that it is, in fact, the human connections. It's the connection between you and your girlfriend, the connection you're about to build with your new baby, the connection between your mother and you, the connection to your father. These are the things that make life meaningful. And if we are dead set on separating or breaking those relationships because of a disagreement about metaphysics, we may have missed the point of life.
I think we have. And there may be some Christians who will say, but where do you get your notion that those connections are important, right?
Mm-hmm.
We hear that question all the time, right? On what do you base your values, your morals, your ethics? How do you get to that?
Yeah.
Well, first, we are evolutionarily geared, sorry to the Yeks, the young earth creationists. We are evolutionarily geared to be social creatures because it helped us with survival. Now, that seems to me to be a far more important. This is wired into our primitive brains,
right?
To be social creatures. You want to know where I get it. I get my desire to be social because I can't survive without it. Right. And so I don't need it handed down from on high. I need it because I can't live without it.
Absolutely.
So if there's a question from your Christian listeners, where do I get it? I get it because it was impossible to be here without it. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it's impossible to be here tomorrow without it. And if you think that I'm wrong, just look at global warming. Mm-hmm. Because it's our lack of caring. Okay, sorry, that's an oversimplification. I don't really want to do that.
Yeah.
But there is some sense in which we have to demonstrate enough social caring to turn that train around.
I want to just respond to what you said there that I think is profound. I joke about being almost pathologically independent, much to my wife's chagrin.
Oh, right.
My inability to ask for help, and it's a deep character flaw, let's just say.
Right. I understand.
But if you put me, in solitary confinement, within a few days, I'm going to start to break down and start scratching at the walls. We need each other.
Right.
You've nailed it there, that we are a social creature. We need one another. We cannot live without each other. And that is such a deeply wired part of what it means to be human.
Right. And it seems to me that, like a lot of other instincts, we don't understand where they come from, right? We don't necessarily understand where the instinct for being hungry comes from. We know we have this feeling about being hungry, right? But we don't have an instinctual evolutionary connection to that feeling any more than we have an instinctual evolutionary connection to understanding the need to be social, right?
Mm-hmm.
We just know we're hungry, and in some way, that's sort of a failure of evolution, that we don't have we don't have like a racial memory about how we became social, right? Because we don't pass down memory. We just pass down these sorts of feelings, right? These instincts.
Yeah.
But to understand an instinct, like the instinct to be social, or the instinct to drink, or the instinct to reproduce, those are things that we need to investigate empirically. And by the way, the listeners, that we do this sort of empirical investigation of these ideas, right? And to depend on writing from thousands of years ago, where the writers were much more poorly prepared to understand those things than we are today,
right,
is another reason that I walked out of Christianity. What does it mean to depend on the insights of writers thousands of years ago? And maybe some, as much as 1,800 years ago, maybe around 200 AD, right?
Yeah.
But what does it mean to depend on those writers' insights and to ignore our own?
Right.
And that's another reason I walked away from Christianity. You're being asked to ignore the insights of your peers, to depend on the insights of people who were sort of poorly written down 2,000 years or more ago. And I can't see a good justification for that.
Yeah.
And I know all the arguments about God speaking directly into. Look, I can preach that sermon. I have preached that sermon.
That's a really good point. I think why we deconverts are so dangerous to the believers around us is that you literally could, on a dime, go do that sermon. You have all that information, you have that theological training, you have that experience.
Right. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica because they searched the scripture daily.
Yes.
I could so preach. I won't, but yes, I can.
Yeah. But my point is, you felt as deeply as the current believers feel that this was true, and you subsequently came to the conclusion that it was not true.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's dangerous.
Okay, so that is dangerous, isn't it? I'll tell you that some of your listeners may have come across the Skeptics and Seekers podcast, or they may have, through some other mechanism, come across a friend of mine, David Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And so David and I were friends all the way back in middle school. We were friends up through high school and early adulthood when we were going to college and forming our early adult relationships and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And David and I were both members of the Church of Christ. Okay. And then we lost touch. We lost touch for 10 years. And somehow, I don't remember exactly how, but we got back in touch. Mm-hmm. almost 15 years ago now. And we were both going through, we were still in church, but we were going through our deconversions, and we couldn't tell each other that we were atheists.
Right. Right.
So it was really funny because
Yeah.
we'd gotten back in touch, and we were having these conversations, and it took us 3 or 4 months. And I don't remember which one of us finally said, "Look, I just got to tell you, this is where you'll probably hang up." And I'm serious. This is the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're members of cult.
Yeah.
Members of cult. And Dave, you're probably going to hang up. This is going to be where we're going to touch again. But I no longer believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so he was in the same place, and we were able to go through this deconversion experience somewhat together.
Yeah.
And that helped us replace that sense of community that we were both losing.
That's fantastic. I think you know how lucky you are to have had a friend to go through that with. I think many, many people, this is a super lonely process that you can feel like you're the only person in the world who's going through these doubts, that maybe there's something wrong with you, and none of that is true. But
That's right.
It feels that way. And when you have the opportunity to then be able to bounce that off another friend, that's just fantastic.
Yeah. And you do. The thing is, for those people who may be considering, I think a lot of people are considering deconversion. The latest Pew Research says that the nuns are 23% of the United States. We are 0.2% higher than the Roman Catholics.
Right.
As of 2018, so that still puts us within a standard deviation, right? So we're essentially the same size population. It's hard to know which is larger, but there are a lot of people considering it, and I contribute to something called the Hotline Project. I don't. Do you know Recovering from Religion?
Yeah, absolutely, and I link to them often. Just to state it explicitly, if you're listening to this right now and you're having these kinds of doubts and you really need someone to talk to, the Recovering from Religion provides that kind of opportunity. I think Andrew's about to describe that. Highly recommend that. So Andrew, please tell them what they might expect.
Okay, will do. So I am a hotline agent. I am on sabbatical right now. I have been for a while, but the Secular Hotline Project, you can go to recoveringfromreligion.org, recoveringfromreligion.org, and click on the Hotline Project link. It'll be on the front page. There will be a number to the Hotline Project. I'm sorry that I can't call it off the top of my head. I should be able to. If you need somebody to talk to about how church has hurt you, or about maybe religion hasn't harmed you at all, but maybe you just wonder, in the depths of the night, when you're grappling with your own sort of disbelief. Or maybe you're not grappling with religion. Maybe you're grappling with your spouse's religion. Or maybe you're grappling with ideas of self-harm. Whatever you're grappling with, you don't have to go to a church clergy member, because there are people who want to reach out to you and talk to you about human problems from a human perspective. And not only will we do that, not only will we hold your hand in the depths of the night and listen to you talk and not push religion back on you, because that's not the job. We will help you find resources. We will help you find friends. We will help you reestablish a sense of community. We'll send you an email with groups in your area.
That's fantastic.
Who are atheists and secularists. And in the end, we won't ask for a damn thing. We won't ask for anything.
That is such an important point, that the difference between the secular counselor or secular hotline agent and, say, a Christian counselor is that there's no agenda. Your message to the person calling in is that they have all of the resources they need within themselves, that they can trust their own decision making, they can trust their own doubts even, and that you just are providing resources for them to accomplish that for themselves, to find the community that would help them to make that happen.
That's absolutely right. And by the way, if you're a Christian and you don't want to leave religion, we're not going to tell you to do that.
Yeah.
We're not going to tell you to leave a community that is safe. All we are is people who want to talk to you about human problems from a human perspective and let you get the help you need, whatever that is. I mean, it might just be a friend twice a week to chat with for a few minutes. So, but we want to do that in a way that doesn't push clergy,
Mm-hmm.
and helps people understand that human problems have human solutions. That's what the Hotline Project is about.
That's fantastic. And I commend Recovering from Religion. I think that's a great organization. It's really good to hear that you are participating with that as well. So
Love them, the good people. So that may have taken us slightly off topic. My apologies.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say, we kind of went into preacher mode, both of us, for a moment there.
Yeah, told you I could preach that sermon.
Yeah. But it does bring up an interesting topic that I do want to get to before we let you go, Andrew, and that is this idea of community. One of the great challenges of going through the deconversion process, and you experienced it in the most dramatic way possible, being basically disfellowshipped or disconnected, whatever term that your particular faith tradition uses, but you are removed from the community, and you can find yourself having just gone through this very emotional, very even traumatic experience of the loss of faith, and with no community to be found. You and I were talking off air about just the challenges of building secular community. What has your experience been as far as finding that community? You mentioned you have your friend Dave, but where else have you found community, and kind of what's your perspective on how we go about building that community?
Oh, that's a good question. That's really good, actually. If I'm being honest, podcasting helped me do this.
Okay.
It did. And the book that I've contributed to, Still Unbelievable. So when we did that book, I was writing weekly dozens of posts over on the Unbelievable discussion boards, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a bunch of skeptics over there. I mean, there's Christians too, right? But we're in this weekly conversation. So one of the skeptics there, Tyler B, is his screen name. Is that still do we still say screen name?
Sure.
But so anyway, Tyler suggested that a couple of us, me and David, the guy I was just talking about, right? Mm-hmm. The guy that shares your name.
Yes.
So the two of you ought to get together and write a book. And he's sort of tongue in cheek, right? But it was a response to Justin Brierley's book, Unbelievable. After 10 years of talking to atheists, I'm still a Christian.
Let me interrupt really quickly.
Oh,
I've mentioned this in Matthew's episode, but I'd like to hear you describe it. For the two people who don't know who Justin Brierley is, who is he and what is his podcast and book about? And then talk about the book that you responded.
Okay, fair enough. So Justin is the eagle after whom all of us sparrows are chasing. Justin is a fantastic radio host, and he's a good podcast host. He is a very fair-minded Christian, and he runs a regular Saturday radio show out of the United Kingdom. In fact, headquartered in London with a group called Premier Christian Radio. He runs the radio show Unbelievable. So Justin is the moderator of that show every week, and he brings together, most of the time, Christians and atheists in conversation about big topics. Now, I'll say that in the last year or two, I think the platform is on the skids a little bit because it continues to be more and more Christians in conversation with Christians, or atheists who are sympathetic to Christian views rather than actually opening the conversation up to view and counter view. Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And I don't think I'm the only one that thinks this, if the boards are a fair representation of that thought, right? But they may not be, because the boards are, it's quite a small population, right? So maybe it's not a fair representation. But Justin is a fantastic radio show host. And he's been talking with atheists and Christians for the last, now it's 12 years. So his book came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And that book was his experience and first foray into Christian apologetics after 10 years of hosting what I really think are probably some of the best radio programs on Christian apologetics topics ever done.
Okay.
Right. And so Justin took the time to write a book about his experience hosting Unbelievable and to sort of reframe the best Christian arguments for Christianity and best responses to atheist arguments that he'd encountered over the last 10 years. It was a good book.
Mm-hmm.
From a sort of two guys sitting in a pub chatting about,
right,
Justin's not a scientist.
Yeah.
But that's not what the book's about. The book is about taking complex arguments and handing them down to people like us who are going to talk about them sitting around the dinner table.
Right.
And we took that seriously because, after all, we're just a few guys having beer, in a pub or sitting around a dinner table. Wasn't just guys, by the way. The best story in the book was penned by someone who goes by the pseudonym Sophie.
Okay.
And Sophie's deconversion experience is actually split up into 3 sections of the book.
Okay.
And Sophie is by far the best writer among us.
Okay.
But the book, Still Unbelievable, is a response to Justin Brierley's book, Unbelievable, by a number of us who have sort of good professional credentials, right? I'm a comp sci guy. Skydive Phil has a deep background in cosmology and astronomy.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew Taylor is, deeply interested in science. And he wrote the first chapter of the book that deals with astronomy and cosmology against Justin's book.
Right.
And so Still Unbelievable is a response book to Justin Brierley's book, Unbelievable. And in fact, at the beginning, we didn't even have a title, right? We just called it Justin Response Book.
Yes.
so for 5 or 6 months as we're writing this thing, because it takes a long time to write books, right?
Sure.
And even with and we had lots of fits and starts and that sort of thing, right? And even now, the book needs a polish. It is hard to gather people from all over the world.
Yes.
And write a book. But we did. And it's a good book because it is the bookend to Justin's book, Unbelievable. Mm-hmm. It is why, after 10 years of listening to Christians and atheists, we are atheists.
Right.
And so, if people are interested, we put the book out free. There will be a volume 2. Matthew and I are working on it now.
That's great.
If you go to Amazon and look up Still Unbelievable, we're the top hit. You cannot put a book on Amazon for free, incidentally. So it'll cost 99 cents to read it on the Kindle, but you don't have to get it from Amazon. You can go to reasonpress.net, reasonpress.net, download the book for free, and see why, after listening to a decade of the best Christian and atheist conversations, we're still atheists.
I really commend you guys for making that book available for free. I think it's Creative Commons licensed. Is that correct?
That is absolutely right. We wanted to be fair to the authors, so the Creative Commons license that we chose was the authors can sell the books. If somebody went to a book fair, mm-hmm. welcome to sell Still Unbelievable and make a couple of dollars. The only thing that we ask is that if a copy of the book is given away, and we want it to be given away, we tried to put it on Amazon for free. We got it there for 99 cents.
Right.
So, you can have it for $1. Yeah. But you can go and get a copy and give it away. You can give it away as many times as you want. You can do anything that you want to with the book. And all that we ask is that you do it as a volume.
Right. And I think Matthew mentioned that even the 99 cents on Amazon, you guys donate that eventually. Is that correct?
That is 100% true. We donate it to American atheists. And it's not like the book is making tens of thousands of dollars, right? So I don't want to mislead people. But it does make a few dollars. We make $15 to $20 a month, right? Mm-hmm. And we make clear that people can get the book for free. So if we hadn't done that, maybe the book would make a lot more, right?
Sure.
But we take those few dollars a month and we donate it because, honestly, I couldn't figure out how to split the proceeds 6 ways,
right,
with people all over the world. But anyway, it was just something that I couldn't figure out easily. And so, we donate the dollars.
That's fantastic. Well, Andrew, I feel like you and I could probably talk for 4 or 5 hours. This feels like a natural stopping point. I do want to make clear that I would love to have both you and Matthew back on again on any topic that you're interested in. So this is not the end of the conversation. Hopefully this is
I
just
appreciate
the
that.
beginning. But very quickly, I want to give you the opportunity to tell how people can get in touch with you. You've mentioned Reason Press. Are there any other things that you want to make clear to people how they can reach you?
Well, they're always welcome to get in touch with me at reasonpress@gmail.com. And the good news about using that particular email address is that Matthew Taylor and David Johnson both share that account with me.
Okay.
And so if you send an email there, I will see it. But there may be a question for Matthew. There may be a sort of general question that isn't targeted specifically at me, but what do atheists think about, right? And so there will be an answer if you use reasonpress@gmail.com. They can also get in touch with me by going to the Reason Press website and offering up a question there. If you've got a question, where you'd like a deeper answer, right? You'd like something that's more intellectual, something that has footnotes or whatever. We make a real attempt to answer Christian questions. And if you read the book, if you read Still Unbelievable, you can go to the reasonpress.net website and get involved in the conversation, because we have discussion boards attached to every chapter. Oh, I think I didn't mention, you can download the book for free, but you can also read it online.
Right.
There at reasonpress.net, and you get involved in the conversation there. I mean, this is a labor of love for us, just like it is for you.
Right.
By all means, come around, drop us a line, agree or disagree. And, we're happy to engage. And as we're winding up, I do want to say we've covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
Right? Because covering a deconversion experience is really covering lots of parts of a person's life.
Yes.
Because this sort of faith experience reaches into everything that we do. Right? So we've covered the map. And I just want to say thank you for letting me tell that story.
Oh, you are very welcome. I say that this is kind of our origin stories in some ways, in that both the faith experience and the deconversion experience dramatically change a person. And as we mentioned earlier, the people who are going through this right now, people listening to this at this moment, can feel so lonely. And to hear somebody like your story and the experiences you went through and the questions you asked, and that may touch somebody, that might speak to them in a way that I can't, or that my previous guests can't. So I thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I love the show. I hope people will listen more, and we won't let this be the last time we get to talk.
Totally agree. Sounds good.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Some final thoughts on the episode. Andrew and I really got into preacher mode there as we were describing recovering from religion and the opportunity for you, if you need to reach out and have someone to chat to. You can definitely hear Andrew's heart for people and the questioning that we go through the deconversion process. I loved the quote that started Andrew to thinking from his friend Sean: "Truth is a process of successive approximations." And how having that perspective, and the perspective of changing the notion of truth to something that can be investigated and that we can get better at, to quote Andrew, is the beginning of understanding that truths handed down from revelation that are immutable, unchangeable, don't work. We have to be able to update our understanding of truth as we gather new information. Andrew's story of nervously telling his friend Dave about his new atheism and deconversion, only to find out that Dave was going through the exact same process, was heartwarming and also very, very encouraging. I wish for all of you listening that you have other deconverts that you can talk to, that you can befriend and share this experience with. It was fascinating to hear Andrew talk about the Church of Christ as a cult and his disfellowship, how painful that was. Many of you may have experienced something similar, being disconnected, disfellowshipped, or rejected. That is one of the harder parts about deconversion, that right when we need community and the love of our peers the most, we can lose all of that. And that's why we need each other. As I mentioned in the intro, Andrew and I hit it off quite a bit. We geeked out a lot. Andrew clearly has a much stronger memory than I do. He was able to quote things that I couldn't remember. I look forward to learning from Andrew as we get to interact with each other going forward. I potentially might show up on Andrew and Matthew's various podcasts. We'll see if that comes to fruition. Otherwise, I look forward to possibly having both of them back on the podcast at some point in time in the future. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.